Obiture Solutions, a leader in secure document printing and a privileged partner in digital transformation, is proud to bring its official support to the group of SIDS Leaders Conference.
Excellencies, ministers, honoured officials from the international agencies, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to this second meeting of the Group of Small Island Developing States Leaders, otherwise known as SIDS. My name is Juliet Foster, and I'll be guiding you through 90 minutes of lively and what I'm sure will be thought-provoking debate on the theme of pandemics, prevention and preparedness. Now, this event builds on the success of the first SIDS leaders meeting, which took place in early May. And at that time, we explored the impact of the Cotonou Trade Agreement on small islands. Now, as the international community begins to build a future beyond COVID-19, small island developing states are demanding a voice in contributing to and indeed benefiting from the process. But it has to start with addressing the distribution of vaccines to the largely vulnerable community of some 38 sovereign small islands across the globe. Now, to put this in perspective, a recent policy brief by the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs reported that the number of COVID-19 related deaths per 100,000 people was actually higher in SIDS compared to other developing country groups and regions, and I'm including within that LDCs and LLDCs. So from the UN to the World Bank, from the EU to the various NGOs, the pandemic is seen as having not only magnified the vulnerabilities of SIDS, but has also faced them with stark choices that have the potential to cause long-term economic and social damage. A 2020 UNCTAD report found that SIDS experienced a GDP fall of 9% compared to a 3.3% decline in other developing countries. At the same time, only 6% of COVID-19 related spending for developing countries was spent on small island developing states. That's an increase of 2% from August 2020. Well, the result of this is that COVID-19 is stretching national budgets to breaking point, with SIDS having to choose between paying off external debts or preparing for another pandemic or even the next tropical storm. Well, as SIDS struggle to repair their public balance sheet, extra funds will be required to finance the immediate health response to lead the way to economic recovery once the pandemic itself is brought under control. It's fair to say that this is a truly massive task for small island developing states who rely on commodity exports, tourism, and indeed other services. So today we're going to explore whether the international community and transnational organisations recognise the enormity of the challenge and whether we're doing enough to help. And what about the vaccine programme? COVAX, the body responsible for making vaccines globally available, has approved another $775 million to fund the delivery of the COVID-19 jab to lower income countries over the next 2 years. Does it go far enough? And how much of a difference will it make realistically? Well, to debate these issues, I'm delighted to say that we have a distinguished panel of experts. They each have an allocated amount of time to give a speech outlining their position, after which they will be asked further questions. And I'd like to stress at that time that it is important for all of you to stick to the amount of time that you have been given, as there is quite a lot of ground that we have to cover in the time available. Also as well, if you could mute your microphones when you're not using them, that would also be very helpful. Now, before we hear those speeches, I would like to call to the floor the co-founder of this SIDS group, His Excellency David Doyle. He is the ambassador of St. Kitts and Nevis, and he's going to share his opening thoughts and indeed some warm words of welcome. So, Excellency, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Juliet. Excellencies, distinguished guests, welcome to this Global SIDS Leaders event devoted to pandemics and its implications for small island developing states. Now, this is the second such event which brings together leading experts from the European Commission, the UN family of organizations, multilateral and bilateral organizations, along with senior ministers from the small islands to debate critical strategic issues about the future stability of this particular community. SIDS makes up something like 38 sovereign states scattered across the globe, from the Caribbean to the Pacific, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean, representing some 20% of the UN membership. It was with a view to giving these particular small islands a more assertive voice at transnational level that the GSL was initiated by the governments of St. Kitts and Nevis, the Solomon Islands, Dominican Republic, and the Seychelles earlier this year to fulfill this ambition. The GSL platform enables these small islands to articulate their strategic vision at transnational level on strategic issues such as the one we're going to discuss today, a damaging pandemic and inflicting huge economic hardship on islands with limited institutional capacity to respond. In collaboration with my co-founding partner, Ambassador Jean-Paul Carteron from the Solomon Islands, we will be rolling out future GSL thematic debates in the next couple of months on social, economic, and financial policy areas affecting SIDS. But let me leave you with one simple thought. Despite representing 20% of the UN membership, the remoteness of these small island developing states, their size, their limited institutional capacity, means that sometimes they struggle to get their voice heard at bilateral and multilateral fora. So ultimately, the GSL initiative seeks to inscribe SIDS' strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats at the heart of the global development agenda, and allows SIDS to become an integral part of the solutions to the big issues that we are trying to tackle globally at the moment, whether it be climate change or combating this pandemic. Allow me in conclusion to thank the sponsors of today's event, Aubetoir Fiduciaire and its president, Nicholas Koudros. Enjoy the event. Thank you.
Ambassador Doyle, thank you so much for that. So let's begin with our first panelist, who's the Honourable Mark Brantley. He is the Premier of St. Kitts and Minister of Foreign Affairs for St. Kitts and Nevis. A lawyer by training, he has previously served as the Deputy Premier and Minister of Tourism, Health, Culture, Youth, Sports and Community Development of the Nevis Island Administration. So, Prime Minister, the floor is now yours and you have 6 minutes. 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. It is really a joy to be here and an honor to greet you, Excellencies, Ministers, and of course, other senior policymakers from various multilateral organizations. I'm delighted to address you today at this session, which is devoted to global SIDS leaders and an initiative that has been started by Ambassador Jean-Paul Carteron and our own ambassador to UNESCO, His Excellency David Doyle. We are delighted to be part of this in the context of putting together for the SIDS of the world a forum where our views can be expressed. Of course, today we have been tasked with discussing this pandemic, and the world has now for over a year been beset with the ravages of COVID-19. To put this in context and being specific to the Caribbean region, SIDS by their nature are extremely vulnerable. While we recognize that much lip service is given internationally to this vulnerability, I confess that we have seen few concrete policy actions in multilateral and multinational fora to address this problem. We are a region in the Caribbean which is beset by climate change and the ravages that we have experienced there. We are, even as I speak, already in the throes of the annual hurricane season here. And we look forward each year with some trepidation to storms that are increasingly ferocious. We have droughts and other weather phenomenon that continues even now to alter our way of life, and that climate change continues to pose an existential threat to small island developing states. In addition to those vulnerabilities, we have, of course, the issue of high debt, and many SIDS and in those in the Caribbean in particular suffer from high debt. Debt continues to be a major problem for us, in large measure because we are forced to borrow to rebuild after every storm, and oftentimes we are forced to borrow at commercial rates from the commercial business houses, in large measure because the world has adopted a particular stance in relation to development, and we suffer from something that is referred to as graduation, where they say to many of us that our GDP per capita passes a particular threshold, and as a consequence, we are locked out of developmental aid and concessionary financing. this exacerbates an already vulnerable problem. And we have continued to assert and continue to request of the international agencies that a vulnerability index be developed to more specifically look at our needs as small island developing states. We have, of course, addition to that, this phenomenon that has developed where certain wealthy countries have continued to put us on lists that they compile of jurisdictions that they say are uncooperative, either in relation to tax matters or in relation to other financial matters. And that these lists, developed most times without consultation with us, cause irreparable reputational harm. Now, I put that by way of background to paint a picture for you of what we were already encountering as small island developing states prior to COVID-19. With the advent of COVID-19 just over a year ago, and we here in St. Kitts and Nevis had our first case in March of 2020. Let us remember that the Caribbean region is one of the most heavily dependent regions in the world on tourism. And so we have had a situation here where our tourism industry has in effect been closed down, been shuttered. Even now, it is trying to reopen, but with a contagious disease, it is very difficult to engage in tourism as we know it. And so the Caribbean region has seen its economies decimated. And in some of our countries in the Caribbean, we have had declines in GDP of double-digit numbers. For already vulnerable economies and for already vulnerable countries, this has exacerbated existing problems. We have a situation where for the first time in a century, the world is faced with a pandemic. There is no playbook, there is no manual that we could pull from a shelf. And so in many ways, countries, large and small, have been forced to grapple with the unknown. And this has created for us untold difficulties in a region where we lack the technical capacity and resources to efficiently and effectively respond. It has, in many of our countries, stretched our health systems to a breaking point. We have tried, through the non-pharmaceutical measures, to handle this pandemic to date. And of course, in more recent times, in fact, starting in about March of this year when vaccines became available, we have sought the route of vaccination. Now, the vaccination, we have been told, is our light at the end of this dark tunnel. But vaccination has posed its own difficulties. Difficulties, first of all, in availability, and difficulties, second of all, that even when they become available, there is a high degree of vaccine hesitancy in our region, where many of our people are refusing, even where vaccines are available, for a number of reasons, not the least of which is the constant flow of misinformation that we find on the internet. And so we are bedeviled by this combination of factors. I have, as I said, set out a picture of our vulnerability before COVID. COVID, therefore, has exacerbated existing vulnerabilities and rendered us in our region, and I think SIDS globally, in an even worse position in terms of our economies, in terms of our ability to respond. We, therefore, require the international community to take into account our special vulnerability. I have said in many forums that we of this region are a proud people. We are not asking for a handout. We continue to ask for a hand up. We are asking for strengthening our facilities, strengthening our technical capacity. We are asking for an awareness in the boardrooms and the executive rooms of the world where major nations meet and make decisions that impact all of us, that they take into account the very real realities that we face on the ground here of an extremely vulnerable people. A single storm, ladies and gentlemen, can wipe out decades of development in these small islands. And COVID has demonstrated that it is not just a hurricane, but it is an ongoing hurricane, because we have been decimated now for well over a year, and we continue even now to be decimated. If it is that we hold true to this notion that no one is safe unless everyone is safe, it means that there's an urgent imperative on those that produce vaccines and those world powers that control the flow of vaccines to make them available to the developing world. We have, for example, in our region, the extreme of Haiti, where up to now, a vaccine rollout has not yet occurred. Haiti is a nation of over 10 million people in the Caribbean. We have others such as Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, where the vaccine rollout has not yet reached to the numbers statistically that we would say are doing well. Here in the Eastern Caribbean, in places like St. Kitts Nevis and Dominica, we have fared slightly better. In fact, I am proud today to say that St. Kitts Nevis has, as a first jab, inoculated 69% of our target population, our adult population, and for a second jab, we are now at about 57%. But we still have some distance to go before we get to that 70% threshold that has been set for herd immunity. And there is therefore a tremendous amount of work to do to access vaccines on the one hand, and two, to combat the misinformation and combat the vaccine hesitancy that we've encountered if our people are truly to be safe. On this journey, we require a greater understanding by the international community, a greater understanding by multilateral organizations. I know that some are represented here today, a greater and better listening ear to the realities of life in our region and the fact that what appears today to be progress can be wiped out in an instant. We are in every respect on the edge, and we would like that policies, concrete policies, be developed that take into account the very special vulnerability of our region, the Caribbean region. I will leave it there. I know that time is short, and I look forward definitely to this engagement and to this ongoing conversation. Thank you.
Minister, thank you so much for that. Please don't go away yet, because I'd like to follow up on a key point which you made in that presentation. You talked about the many challenges that your country is facing in terms of rolling out the vaccines. But given those challenges, the backdrop against which you're operating, how would you gauge the progress to date in vaccinating the population? And more to the point, how far off is that population from being fully vaccinated?
Well, as I indicated, here in St. Kitts and Nevis, we've done relatively well in comparison to some of our neighbors. In fact, we are, as I said, at 69% of our adult population has already taken the first jab, and some 57% have taken 2 jabs. The vaccine of choice here has been the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. And so I hope that we are close. I say I hope because some of the reasons for the vaccine hesitancy defy logic, and it make it very difficult to engage, because many members of our population hold very fiercely to notions and things that they've read or seen on the internet. And so that is something that we are battling. I would hope we have reopened our vaccination efforts starting on Thursday, that is tomorrow. And after a hiatus of about a week, because we had run out of vaccines, through engagement with Caribbean colleagues, we have obtained another 5,000 doses that we hope to start administering on Thursday. So it is my hope that within another week or two, we should get to that threshold of 70%. But of course, we understand that that is, at the end of the day, only a starting threshold, and that we have to continue the vaccination effort, which will allow us to reopen our country more fully, but also allow us critically to reopen our borders more fully and allow guests once again to come, because our industry, our economy, is so heavily dependent on tourism. Absent the tourists, it's going to be a very, very difficult road for recovery, not only for St. Kitts and Nevis, but I think for the rest of the Caribbean.
Of course, a very familiar theme that we've heard a great deal about, but thank you so much, Minister, for taking that question. I would now like to hand the floor to Ambassador Mr. Li Song, who is the Deputy Permanent Representative of the People's Republic of China to the United Nations in Geneva and other international organizations in Switzerland. Ambassador, thank you so much for being with us. The floor is now yours, and you have 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Juliet. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it gives me a great pleasure to attend this important virtual session. As the pandemic continues to rampage around the world, the states are now facing multiple challenges such as the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, natural disasters, and sustained livelihood. The international community should pay more attention to the needs of the seeds and provide assistance to them. Today's exchange will provide an opportunity for us to share views in this regard and help support the seeds to combat COVID-19 pandemic and promote sustainable development. Since the outbreak of the pandemic, the Chinese government has adopted the most thorough and stringent prevention and control measures, being responsible towards the Chinese people and the international community. China has successfully brought the spread of the virus under control in less than 2 months, which has been broadly acknowledged by the WHO and countries around the world. China has been we have been actively participating in and promoting international cooperation in an open, transparent, and responsible attitude. We had provided information to WHO in the most timely fashion and released the genome sequence at the earliest possible time. We also invited several WHO expert teams to China to assess the situation of the pandemic and study the zoonotic source of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. The report of this joint WHO-China study has been released by WHO in March and reached science-based, professional, and authoritative findings. In the meantime, China keeps providing assistance to international organizations and countries in need to the best of our ability, contributing our experiences, wisdom, and strengths to the global fight against the pandemic. China has provided medical supplies to over 150 countries and 13 international organizations. President Xi Jinping has solemnly announced that the Chinese vaccine would be made a global public good. We are honoring our words with concrete actions and contribute to the ensuring accessibility and affordability of vaccines in developing countries. To date, China has provided 450 million doses of Chinese vaccines in nearly 100 countries. At the Global Health Summit last month, President Xi Jinping announced the major steps China would take to support international efforts to defeat the virus, once again, sending China's strong message for solidarity to the world. China actively supports the seeds in fighting against COVID-19 by stepping up policy coordination, providing anti-pandemic supplies, and convening video conferences for medical experts, which further enhance cooperation in our joint endeavor in fighting against the virus. Since last year, China has held several special ministerial meetings on COVID-19 with Pacific Island countries and Caribbean countries to share experiences in pandemic prevention and control, as well as diagnosis and treatment, affirming China's commitment of supporting the seeds in pandemic control and economic recovery, and call upon international community to provide more support to the seeds in combating pandemic, promoting economic recovery, and addressing climate change and other global challenges. The COVID-19 has wreaked havoc on global economic and social development, brought negative impact to the livelihood of the seeds people, and widened the development divide among the seeds and other regions. The pandemic is yet another reminder that we, humanity, rise and fall together with a shared future. The international community should work together to promote solidarity and cooperation, draw on experiences to enhance preparedness and capacity for coping with major public health emergencies, and help most vulnerable countries to get back on track in their national economic and social development. First, we need to to call for solidarity and cooperation. All parties should uphold the UN-centered international system, support WHO in playing a leading role in the global fight against COVID-19, and oppose any politicization of the pandemic. To better achieve the outcomes of the Global Health Summit, we need to adopt a science-based approach to fight against the pandemic, step up cooperation on vaccines, diagnostics, and coordinate our joint response efforts. Second, we need to close the immunization gap. We should make vaccines a global public good, promote equitable distribution of vaccines in all countries, and oppose vaccine nationalism. All parties should support the effort made by UN system in promoting global immunization, support WHO's efforts to speed up the COVID-19 vaccine global access facility, and improve the accessibility and affordability of vaccines globally, especially in the seeds. Third, we need to address both the symptoms and root causes. It is important that we strengthen the role of the UN and the WHO and improve the global disease prevention and control system. It is important that we enhance our capacity for monitoring, early warning, and emergency response. It is also important we enhance our capacity of treatment of major pandemics, of contingency reserve, and logistics, of fighting disinformation, and of providing support to developing countries. Fourth, we need to champion inclusiveness and sharing. We need to scale up efforts to advance the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We need to conduct international climate cooperation in accordance with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. And we should also support the seeds to protect the marine ecosystem and make their economy more resilient and sustainable. Dear friends, China will continue to stand for the vision of building a community with a shared future of mankind, support COVID-19 responses and economic and social recovery in the seeds and other developing countries, promoting the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, and build a better future together with the seeds and the international society as a whole. I thank you.
Ambassador, thank you, not just for that excellent speech, but also for the promise contained within it. Now that I know you have to leave us because you do have another engagement, but we appreciate the fact that you were able to make the time to be here. So thank you so much for your contribution. I'd now like to hand the floor to Dr. Sylvie Briand, who is the head of Pandemic and Epidemic Department at the World Health Organization. Now, Dr. Briand led the Global Influenza Program during the 2009 swine flu pandemic, and she was also responsible for launching the WHO Information Network for Epidemics, the aim of which is to counter misinformation about coronavirus. So, Dr. Briand, it's good to see you. The floor is now yours, and you have 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Juliette, and Excellencies and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be with you today, and I would like to thank the organizers of this meeting, and in particular the Crans-Montana Forum and Jean-Paul Carteron for the invitation. Actually, we all know that this pandemic has been a tragedy, and unfortunately, it's not over. And the impact has been particularly enormous on developing countries and states. The impact has been first on health, and because you know that there is an enormous amount of cases and deaths, but also the impact has been on health systems. First, because many health workers were victims of the COVID-19 disease. Actually, in 2020, October 2020, we had 7% of the cases were in health workforce. And so it's very important because in some countries, really the health workers are in limited number. And so when some of them become ill or even die, I mean, it's really a loss for the health system. And also because while the health system is dealing with COVID-19, they cannot attend other diseases. And in particular, routine vaccination programs have been particularly impacted during this pandemic. And so we know now that there are cohorts of children that are not protected against other epidemic disease. So it's a real concern. At the same time, as Minister Brundtland said, there was an enormous impact also on societies and economies, and in particular in developing countries and in SIDS. And this impact will go beyond this pandemic as well, because the recovery will last longer. And so we need to pay particular attention at this recovery period and support those countries to recover more promptly and being better prepared for next events, because we know that at global level, the risk of pandemics and epidemics is increasing. Fortunately, we have more tools to deal with them, but still the risk is increasing. And so we need really to be cognizant that we need to get better prepared and be ready for next emergence of new disease. So the problem for most of the developing countries is that while they are still struggling with COVID-19, they also have to deal with other epidemics, because the other causes of increase in patients in hospital have not decreased. We still have cholera outbreaks, yellow fever outbreaks, dengue outbreaks, and many other outbreaks are still ongoing. And so it's very important to understand that the burden on certain countries, it's really enormous. And this is why the international community needs to join forces and support those countries who are particularly vulnerable. So being an island, sometimes it's an opportunity, because with regard to epidemics, you can, of course, close your border and prevent the virus from entering the country. But as Minister Brundtland said, it's also a double-edged sword, because at the same time, you prevent tourism, and so the impact on your economy can be really high. But also being an island, it's a lot of challenges, in particular with access to commodities, and it's not only vaccine, but we have seen also it can be a problem to access oxygens, personal protective equipment, and many other communities like diagnostic tests that are absolutely essential to deal with the pandemic disease. So we see that there are particular vulnerabilities in SIDS, and that's why it deserves a particular treatment as well. And we need to be particularly also cautious when we develop global plans to support developing countries, to not forget SIDS and their particular needs that are different. Where are we now? As you know, the virus, unfortunately, is evolving, and we see that new variants are emerging. And so the last one, the Delta variant, is particularly challenging because the transmissibility is higher. When we see a new variant, we look at 5 things. First, is it more transmissible? Is this variant more virulent? And what is the impact on the variant on diagnostic, therapeutics, and vaccine? So although the Delta variant is more transmissible, fortunately so far, we don't see an increased virulence in this variant. And the impact on vaccine, diagnostic, and therapeutic, so far it's moderate, meaning that the existing vaccines are still working very well on this variant. And that's why it's very important to have the vaccination strategy should really target in priority, especially when the vaccines are scarce, the people with more likelihood to have a severe disease and getting hospitalized, because those people will benefit a lot from the vaccine, as most of the vaccine currently are protecting from severe disease and hospitalization. And those people are, of course, the elderly, but also the people with underlying conditions such as diabetes, cancer, immunosuppression, and cardiovascular disease, for instance. So targeting vaccine towards the most vulnerable group, at-risk group, is very important. And of course, it's important to protect health workforce as well by first providing them protective equipment, but also vaccinating them in priority so that they can continue to support the increasing number of patients coming with COVID-19. And finally, I would like to highlight the issue of misinformation. Actually, we call this at WHO the infodemic, which is not only misinformation, but it's just the increase of information during an outbreak. Some of this information is accurate, other information is not accurate, but the result is that people don't know who to believe and how to translate this information into behavior that will protect their health and the health of their communities. So this tsunami of information, this infodemic during epidemic is not a new phenomenon. We see this with every epidemic, whether it's Ebola, yellow fever, cholera, we always see an infodemic. But this time with this COVID-19 pandemic, it has been particularly severe because of two things. First, it's a global event. So, and as internet is connecting us throughout the planet, everybody has access to loads of information. And so it's even more difficult to understand what is happening. But second thing also is that because people now are connected through social media platform, they are more vulnerable also to misinformation. And so that's why at WHO we take this very seriously, and we encourage our member states to do the same and have specific strategies to manage the infodemic, which is on one hand provide good information to the population, but also listen to population concerns so that the information that is provided answers their concern in priority. And you can also debunk misinformation as soon as it appears and reassure people in a timely manner. And finally, we also encourage member states to empower community, engage with communities, because communities are also the solution to the disease transmission, and they need to be at the forefront at the same level with health system, healthcare workers, and national authorities. So with this, I will stop because the time is short, but many thanks for this invitation.
And many thanks to you, Dr. Briand, for that excellent presentation. You actually preempted a question I wanted to put to you about the impact of misinformation to these small island developing states, but you have addressed that question beautifully, and thank you so much for that, and also for making the time, because I know that you too must leave us, but thank you so much for your contribution. Let me now hand the floor to John Ryan, who is the Director for Public Health, Directorate General for Health and Food Safety at the European Commission. Mr. Ryan was previously a Commission representative on the board of the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control. So, Mr. Ryan, the floor is now yours, and you have 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Mr. Ryan, we can't actually hear you. You need to unmute your microphone. Oh, you have. We seem to have a few technical problems connecting to Mr. Ryan. Can we try again, please? We are trying to connect to you, Mr. Ryan, so thank you so much for your patience. But listen, whilst we wait to connect you, let's hear from another of our speakers. We will return to you, Mr. Ryan, I can promise you that. And I'd like to introduce Mr. John Zoet. Now, John Zoet is the Director of Strategy, Risk and Results at the World Bank. And importantly, within the context of today's meeting, he is responsible for World Bank policy intervention covering all small states, islands or landlocked. And prior to this role, he was the bank's country director for Turkey. So John Zoet, the floor is now yours, and you have 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Juliet. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. And thanks for the invitation to be here. Obviously, the World Bank has been following the COVID pandemic very closely. We know that it's pushed about 120 million people globally into extreme poverty over the last year. And for the first time in about 20 years, poverty is likely to have significantly increased, reversing the gains of the last decade. We also know that the recovery from COVID will be slow and uneven, particularly for small states, and particularly for those small states, many of them SIDS, who rely on tourism. And we, of course, are aware that the challenge of recovering from COVID combines with many other enormous challenges that small states face, from natural disasters and climate change, to which they're particularly vulnerable, to having narrow, undiversified economies, and often high levels of dependence on a few commodities or exports. We know that the impact of COVID on small states has been disproportionate. The Premier of Nevis was mentioning the collapse of real GDP for many small states. On average, it's contracted about 7 to 8% compared to about 2.5% for all emerging markets. And many small island economies that are tourist dependent have seen double-digit decline. So this has been an enormous hit. We've seen the tourism sector decline by something between 60 and 80% globally last year, resulting in a loss of revenue of about $1 trillion. So we also expect that most tourist-dependent economies will not be able to return to pre-crisis levels of economic activity until sometime in 2022, with much of that dependent on the success of vaccination campaigns against COVID, not just in the small states themselves, but also in countries where tourists originate. So this has been a massive shock for small states. It's caused significant economic decline, but also direct and indirect job losses. It's thrown a lot of people into poverty, and it has disproportionately, by the way, affected women who have had to pick up extra responsibilities, for instance, for childcare and elderly care, as normal activities and normal arrangements have been disrupted. So the World Bank has been responding to this pandemic in a number of ways. We have a 4-pillar strategy focused on saving lives, helping the poor and vulnerable, keeping companies and businesses afloat, and also helping countries to build back better and recover better. We've provided financial support to about 30 small states so far, amounting to more than $1 billion. For us, small states are states with a population of less than 1.5 million people. It includes both island economies, but also non-island economies that meet that particular criterion. So $1 billion has gone to that group since the beginning of April of last year, and about $600 million of that has been for COVID response. We, as you probably know, in the bank have 2 financing arms. One is IDA, the International Development Association, the International Development Association, which provides concessional financing. About 10, 12 years ago, IDA increased its annual availability for small states by about 10-fold. We went from 1.5 million SDRs to 15 million SDRs, no matter how big the small state is. And so we've seen a very, very strong increase in the amount of concessional financing that goes to small states. National allocations tripled for most small states over that period of time. And by the way, we have many countries that would not be eligible for concessional financing at the World Bank if they were large states, but are eligible under a special exemption that makes them continue to have access to concessional financing even after they pass the threshold for concessional borrowing. And a result of this, by the way, is that the average small state now receives about $85 per capita from IDA, if it's IDA eligible, compared to about $15 per capita for non-small states, of which, by the way, some, such as some of the Sahel countries, are actually poorer and more vulnerable than small states are. We're in the process right now of replenishing IDA. IDA loses money. That's the nature of concessional lending. You don't get all the money paid back, so you need fresh money to be injected into the structure. We do that every 3 years, but because of COVID-19, IDA 19, which is our most recent replenishment period, was shortened to 2 years instead of the normal 3 years to make it possible for us to give countries a much larger financing boost. We've done that, and we're now in the midst of negotiating the IDA 20 replenishment. And I really hope that small states will make their voices heard with respect to the IDA donors as we go through that replenishment process. And the Small States Forum, which my department in the World Bank manages, and which meets alongside both the annual meetings and the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, is intended to help give small states the voice to make that possible. We have also done a lot on the IBRD side. I won't spend that much time talking about that. Suffice it to say that if you are a small state that is eligible for IBRD financing, you receive the most preferential terms that IBRD has, and you are also exempted from the pricing increase that went through in 2000.
I believe that we have a few problems there because the connection appears to have frozen to John Zoot of the World Bank. So apologies for that. Maybe we will be able to restore it, but I know that time is very, very tight. In fact, I can confirm that we have lost that connection to John Zoot of the World Bank. But Mr. Zoot, thank you so much for your contribution. Can I now reintroduce John Ryan, Director for Public Health, Directorate General for Health and Food Safety at the European Commission. I'm not going to tempt fate by telling the panel more about you, but sir, the floor is now yours. I know that you are very strapped for time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for organizing and inviting me. So the first point I wanted to make is that, of course, the pandemic has shown the interface between health and many other policies. The minister spoke earlier on and spoke about the impact on society as a whole, on the economy, on tourism, on travel. And this is something we've also seen in the European Union, where there has been a recognition that health is really underpinning many of these other rights and policies that we have. We have mobilized all of the instruments available to us in the European Union in order to support the response to the pandemic, particularly by trying to coordinate the 27 member states, by making the interface between our member states and the international community, by securing medical supplies and vaccines, and of course by working to try and organize the reopening of society, keeping the economy safe, keeping our population safe. The EU vaccine strategy is perhaps a good example of the power of working together. Within a few months, the 27 member states of the European Union procured 2.3 billion doses of vaccine, and in addition to the original procurement, we have now managed to purchase an additional 2 billion doses on top of the 2.3 that we originally had. And of course, we're using these vaccines, which were developed in a very record time, to also contribute to the international efforts. On the EU level, we have succeeded in vaccinating 60% of our population with at least one dose and 40% with a second dose. So these numbers are growing on a daily basis. And as our colleague from WHO said, we've got to be careful about the variants of the virus, which are transmitting in different places around the world, including in Europe. So the sequencing efforts to increase the knowledge of where these new variants are appearing is very important, and also checking, of course, to see what effect they have on vaccine efficacy. We are trying to learn lessons at the moment, and these will be lessons which we will learn in terms of the internal EU legislation on cross-border health threats, but also the financial investments which we need to reinforce our health systems. And I would say it's important that we develop global solidarity and cooperation. In addition to COVAX, to which we're contributing in a very substantial way. We're also hoping that the discussions on the pandemic treaty, which are going on at the moment in the context of WHO, and also the strengthening of WHO, will also be ingredients in the follow-up to this pandemic. So the European Union, I think, is fully engaged not only for its own protection, but also to try and show solidarity and support to other parts of the world, including the group of small island developing states. Thank you very much.
There, my microphone is now unmuted. But John Ryan, thank you so much for that presentation. I know that you have to leave us, but we thank you for the time that you were able to spend with us outlining the vision going forward. And I would like to hand the floor back to John Zoet of the World Bank. Unfortunately, we had a few connection problems, but the line has now been restored. So I'm going to hand the floor back to you. Thank you so much, John Zoet. John, I believe there are some problems with your microphone. We can't actually hear you. Is the microphone unmuted? The microphone is unmuted. So once again, it seems that we're plagued by some of the technology demons that unfortunately have a tendency to wear up once in a while. But we are across the problem. So if you can hear me.
Okay, it looks like, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now. That's wonderful. So the floor is now yours. If you can pick up where you left off.
Okay, thank you. So the host was muting my mic apparently, so I sent a message explaining that. So so Juliet, I don't know if I talked to you about the financing that the World Bank has made available. I don't know if that was heard or not. Could you just let me know?
Please do go through it because we did have those sound problems, so it's possible that some of our audience missed that, but do share it with us, please.
Okay, so what I was saying is that the World Bank makes financing available in two ways: through the Concessional International Development Association. We've provided about $1 billion of financing to 30 small states since April of last year, and of that $1 billion, about 600 million was available for COVID response. That's been a very significant amount of money. A lot of it is available to small states that are actually above the IDA cutoff for eligibility. We have a special exemption for small states that allows them, under certain circumstances, to borrow on IDA terms despite being above that amount. And as a consequence, the average per capita allocation of IDA concessional resources to eligible small states is around $85 per capita, compared to around $15 per capita for non-small states. So that's a very, very significant increase. We also provide IBRD financing, that's the non-concessional financing of the bank, to small states that are above the IDA cutoff and also not eligible under the special exemption for small states. There, small states have access to the most attractive IBRD pricing, and they were also exempted from the price increase that went through in 2018 as part of the capital package agreement for the World Bank agreed with World Bank donors. So very significant financing for small states. We are currently very strongly focused on vaccine acquisition and deployment. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is critical for enabling small states to emerge from COVID, particularly those small states that are dependent on tourism. We currently have 40 countries with vaccine projects that are financed by the World Bank. 8 of those 40 are small states. We are making our support available to any country that wants it. So there are many other operations in the pipeline. The big constraint right now is not so much financing, but the availability of vaccines on the market. And we are working very closely both with COVAX and with the African Union Vaccine Acquisition Task Team, as well as manufacturers through our private sector arm, the International Finance Corporation, to help acquire and deploy vaccines to as many poorer countries as we possibly can, and of course also to small states. This is a very, very important effort at the moment. So let me leave it there and pass it back to you, Juliette.
Thank you very much for that, John Zoot. Please don't go away, because there was so much there which gives ground for tremendous optimism. Clearly, a lot is happening in terms of the finance tools that the bank is making available to the SIDS regions. But what are you expecting in terms of outcomes? And given the difficulties and the fact that you are working with COVAX, is it perhaps premature or optimistic to look for a timeline when the positives can occur, the positive outcomes?
Well, I think the good news is that we've seen a lot of vaccines come on stream over the last 6 months or so. Manufacturing capacity is stepping up. We're seeing some of the richer countries that frankly locked up a lot of the early vaccine availability starting to release doses, granting those doses to poorer countries, or releasing them back into the market. That will help as well. But the reality is that for many countries, particularly if there is also the need for a booster, which is, I believe, still undecided technically, but if there is need for a booster, many countries will find that they will not be able to get sufficient shares of their population vaccinated until sometime in 2022 to be able to have herd immunity. So many countries are still facing serious challenges.
And I'm glad as well that you've mentioned that the booster vaccination, because that is certainly the debate that we're hearing in many developed economies around the world. But John Zoot, thank you so much for that and really outlining the World Bank's position. I want to stay with the financial theme to bring in my next guest, who is Nicolas Koutros. Now, Nicolas is the Chief Executive Officer of Oberthor Fiduciaire. Now, this company is one of the world's leading privately owned security printers, which specializes in the production of banknotes, associated secure services, and security demands. That's part of what they do. They do so much more than that. That is just a broad brush outline. But can I hand the floor to you now? Nicolas Koutros, you have 5 minutes. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Juliette, and thank you for the introduction. And I would like to thank Ambassador Jean-Paul Carteron for inviting us to participate in this conference, which is, of course, very, very actual. A few words about our company before I move on to the very subject of this conference. Oberthor Fiduciaire has been founded in 1842. It is a family-owned company, as you have mentioned, is a leader in banknotes, security documents, and solutions worldwide. So we are very familiar with problems, with situations, crisis situations in different countries all over the world. And we have the structure and the infrastructure to address and find solutions in case we have to face a crisis. We have, of course, manufacturing units that are accredited with the highest standards of quality and security. Anti-fraud security was, until very recently, our DNA, and it still remains our DNA. But in more than a year ago, we have realized that the technology that we are using since practically 20 years for banknotes and security documents, which is antifungal, antiviral, and antibacterial, was effective, and of course is still effective, against the families of coronaviruses. So we have taken a decision to make this technology available to other areas, to other industries, than the very, very narrow industry that we are in and we were in right now. So since a year, we are examining possibilities on how to protect surfaces and how to make objects that we are touching on a daily basis more secure and avoid contamination. We're not talking about products that will disinfect for a couple of minutes surface. We're talking about products that have a durable protection, and we have tested that in banknotes in circulation that were in circulation for 5 years, and the technology is still very efficient. So right now, objects like the one I can show you here, it's just photocopy paper. It's protected against the virus, and the table, the desk that my computer is on, has been varnished to be as well protected against the virus. At this stage, what I would like to say is remind our auditors what the Director General of the World Health Organization has said a few months ago. Governments and individuals, I'm just reading, must remember that vaccines alone will not keep us safe. Basic public health measures remain the foundation of the response. And this is where our technology comes in. And as you can imagine, we have mentioned the problems, the budgetary problems that small islands and other countries have and can have regarding the current situation. Technology can help to reduce as well the cost of handling a patient by just avoiding someone to be contaminated. So this is the way we see the future, and this is the way we are building what we call the next normality. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Nicholas Koutros. Don't go away, because I will put some questions to you a little bit later on. For now, I would like to bring back our first speaker, Mark Brantley, the Honourable Mark Brantley, I should say. He is, of course, the Premier of St Kitts and Minister of Foreign Affairs for St Kitts and Nevis. So thank you so much for staying with us. And look, I'd like to get your comments on what you've heard so far, because clearly there is tremendous commitment and recognition to the plight of SIDS countries such as yours. We've heard this from the World Bank, for example, and the European Union. Do you feel optimistic now that your experiences are being taken on board? They are really being listened to, that you can be part of this solution going forward?
Well, I think when you're from the Caribbean and you represent SIDS, you have no choice but to be optimistic. The reality, however, is that sometimes our optimism isn't matched, and that commitments made are kept. I'm very, very pleased at the tone and content of this conversation. I feel that those who are in attendance here, my colleagues, understand the problem, and part of solving the problem is clearly understanding it and accepting that there is a concern. For my colleague from the World Bank, for example, he spoke about the making available of financing. And that has bedeviled us in our region, because I go back to the point I made about the fact that many of us are treated as middle-income or high-income countries on a sterile analysis of GDP per capita with no regard whatsoever to our extreme vulnerability. And so as a consequence, we are locked out from accessing a lot of concessionary financing that will otherwise, of course, be critical in helping us to build capacity. So that's a problem that we keep advocating in every forum, that there has to be some type of vulnerability index which takes into account the extreme vulnerability of SIDS and those of us in the Caribbean in particular. Just to give you a sense of how this has worked, that even in terms of our participation in the COVAX facility, that these types of criteria were also used to look at one's standing in terms of GDP per capita to determine how one could participate and at what cost in the COVAX facility. So that even a facility like that was designed to save lives ultimately had these restrictions, if you will, or parameters put on it. I will make one last point that wasn't addressed, but that is that even in terms of access now to vaccines, we are getting from the pharmaceutical companies that they require indemnification to make vaccines available to many of us. And so even those countries that have the resources to purchase vaccines are being told that you must indemnify and hold us harmless, so that if these vaccines approved for emergency use by the WHO cause any harm, that these companies are held blameless. And that, of course, is another obstacle that is being put up in the way of vaccine access and making this life-saving technology available to more people across our region and across our world. So that too is a concern that we have in terms of small, vulnerable countries which are not vaccine producers, but are being asked to access vaccines to save lives, that the governments here must indemnify large multinational pharmaceutical companies, which have budgets far in excess sometimes of all the SIDS combined. So that gives a sense of what we are dealing with. And we think that policies that have, I believe, a more humane and an approach that recognizes our extreme vulnerability are the types of policies that we really would like to see inform international policy making and policy making at the multilateral level. Thank you very much again, and thank you for this glorious opportunity to engage with so many brilliant minds from across the world.
Minister, we thank you as well for your time, and you have to leave us because there have been events in the Caribbean tragically involving Haiti, and I know that you need to address those. So thank you so much for your time. Let me return to the speaker who was talking before you, and this is Nicolas Courtros, who's the Chief Executive of Oberthur Fiduciaire. I want to focus on the antiviral banknotes. It is groundbreaking, but how much of a potential game changer could these currencies be for small island developing states? Would I be right in assuming that the importance lies in perhaps the fact that the alternatives to conventional cash that many developed societies take for granted, digital wallets, etc., then that you don't have that degree of proliferation? So these banknotes are literally a lifesaver in that context. We have a few problems hearing you, Nicolas. So can we hear you?
Here we are.
Yes, that's fantastic. We can hear you. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, as I have already mentioned, it's not, there's no miracle. There's no solution that will provide a miracle. So we need to take a number of measures in order to prevent this pandemic and other pandemics that are going to come by spreading around the world. So antiviral banknotes is one of the objects that, of course, are changing hands every day over years. And this can be very efficient when you have this kind of technology, BioGuard technology, for the population that is using it. But in addition to that, any other object that can be protected, that can prevent contamination, is going to help everyday's life in the SIDS and in other countries, and of course help the economy and the social life of the populations.
Okay, Nicolas Courtros, thank you so much. Please don't go away because we will have time for some more general questions. What I'd like to do now is to introduce Maria Helena Simodo. Now, she is the Deputy Director General of the FAO, that is the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. She's also held several key positions in the government of the small island state of Cabo Verde, including Minister for Fisheries, Agriculture and Rural Affairs, as well as coordinator of the Permanent Interstate Committee for Drought Control in the Sahel. Now, unfortunately, she can't be with us, but she has sent this pre-recorded message. So this is the message from Maria Helena Simodo.
Honorable Minister Mark Brantley, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, small island developing states with their geographic isolation and limited natural resources share unique and specific vulnerabilities. Being from Cabo Verde, I know this firsthand. Small island developing states, or SIDS, are more vulnerable to natural disasters and climate change impacts, rely heavily on food imports, and suffer from high rates of both obesity and undernourishment, all of which take a heavy toll on national development efforts and results in complex food security and nutrition challenges, and all significantly worsened by the COVID-19 pandemic. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations works closely with small islands developing states to ensure more efficient inclusive, resilient, and sustainable agri-food systems. Let me share a few examples. In 2017, to implement the Samoa Pathway, FAO launched the Global Action Programme on Food Security and Nutrition in Seeds. Through our interregional initiative, we work with seeds partners and donors to create enabling environments for food security and nutrition, to support sustainable, resilient, and nutrition-sensitive food systems, and to empower people and communities to lead healthy and productive lives. Currently, 8 Seas have joined FAO's flagship hand-in-hand initiative to accelerate inclusive and resilient agri-food systems transformation and promote sustainable rural development. Such support is particularly important for seeds, who often have limited national capacities and international assistance. We hope to get more seeds on board. Fisheries is a major food and income source for many small island states. That's why we are promoting Blue Transformation, which can amplify the unique benefits of aquatic foods for food and nutrition security, livelihoods and trade through sustainable ecosystem management and efficient, viable and inclusive blue value chains. To improve nutrition, FAO is helping small islands develop and implement national food-based dietary guidelines, one of the game-changing solutions highlighted in the upcoming United Nations Food Systems Summit. As seeds are particularly vulnerable to climate change impacts, FAO's work focuses on improving their resilience, livelihoods, and health. That means ensuring that agriculture and food security is fully integrated across national plans, enhancing weather warning systems and using new methodologies to assess damage and loss. With increasing global urbanization, FAO's Green Cities initiative aims to improve the lives of urban dwellers with greater access to products and services provided by green space and greener lifestyles. Given the unique needs of small islands, we will develop a specific program for seeds. We cannot ignore the role of women, who represent 52% of the agricultural labor force in seeds and are essential change agents to ensure the shift to more efficient and climate resilient agri-food system. Gender equality is essential for developing sustainable tourism and agribusiness in seeds. Empowering women can unlock much needed rural transformation and benefit all of society. We know that now we need to put the policies and actions in place to get there. With the devastating socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic, FAO's COVID-19 response and recovery program is ramping up efforts to strengthen the resilience of agri-food systems and livelihoods, placing seeds, among others, at its heart. Before concluding, I would like to announce that FAO will hold a Seed Solution Forum on 30-31 August. We'll focus on innovation and digitalization to address COVID-19 impacts and to accelerate the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals related to agri-food systems, nutrition, health, the environment, and climate change resilience in seeds. I invite you all to participate. Together, we can help small island development states build back better. Thank you.
That was Maria Helena Semudo of Cabo Verde. She is the Deputy Director General of the FAO, that is the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. Important date there for the diary, the forum on the 31st of August for SIDS states. Let me now introduce Mr. Eladio Perez. Now, he is the Vice Minister of Health for the Dominican Republic, and he is standing in for his colleague, the new Minister of Public Health from that country, Daniel Rivera. So unfortunately, Mr. Perez can't be with us in person, but he very kindly recorded this message for this special meeting.
Les extiendo un cordial saludo a todos los presentes en esta importante plataforma donde compartiremos la manera en que República Dominicana combate la enfermedad COVID-19. Igualmente, algunas informaciones generales de interés de esta pandemia que atravesamos. La enfermedad COVID-19 es una infección causada por un virus SARS-CoV-2 que sin duda alguna marcó un antes y un después en la historia de la humanidad. Las repercusiones de esta crisis sanitaria afectaron todas las áreas de la sociedad. Afortunadamente, el gobierno dominicano, a través de este Ministerio de Salud Pública y diferentes actores de la sociedad, sobre todo con la colaboración científica y médica del país, asumimos el reto de garantizar la salud de todos los dominicanos. Para estos fines, fortalecimos los protocolos de manejo clínico con el objetivo de mejorar el diagnóstico y tratamiento oportuno de esta enfermedad, para así responder de forma adecuada a las necesidades de la población dominicana. Además, se implementó a través del Gabinete de Salud que preside nuestra vicepresidenta Raquel Peña, el Plan Nacional de Vacunación con el compromiso de vacunar a más de 7 millones de personas mayores de 18 años durante el 2021. Recientemente se destaca la inclusión de la población de 12 a 18 años, así como también la aplicación de la vacuna a mujeres embarazadas a partir del segundo trimestre. Gracias a la conjunción de esfuerzos, hoy la República Dominicana es uno de los países con mejor cobertura vacunal para la enfermedad COVID-19 en Latinoamérica y el Caribe. Nos sentimos honrados en decir que a la fecha contamos con más de 3 millones de vacunados con segunda dosis y más de 5 millones con primera dosis. Es decir, tenemos más de 8 millones de dosis aplicadas, demostrando la respuesta ejemplar de la sociedad dominicana con la aceptación de la vacunación. A pesar de esto, no podemos disminuir los esfuerzos. La pandemia nos sirve de enseñanza para que todos los países posean un plan estratégico de preparación y respuesta para las enfermedades emergentes, que representen una amenaza para la salud de cualquier población. La salud es uno de los bienes más importantes de todos los seres humanos. Este momento nos invita a tomar conciencia sobre la importancia de tener un sistema de salud fortalecido, con las competencias necesarias para poder cumplir con nuestro compromiso público de calidad, promoción de la salud, así como también brindar un mejor futuro a los dominicanos.
A special thank you there to Eladio Perez, who's the Vice Minister of Health for the Dominican Republic. Thank you for that pre-recorded message, and indeed thank you to all of our panelists for their contributions and also for their patience. Unfortunately, we have been bedeviled by a few technical problems, but we are getting through them. Such is the nature of the game. And I'm delighted to say that we do have time for a few questions. And I'd like to put the first of these questions, if I may, to Councillor Fen Yong of the Permanent Mission of China to the United Nations Office at Geneva and other international organizations in Switzerland. I'm afraid my Chinese is not very good, but ni hao. It's a pleasure to see you. And just to remind our audience as well that he has very gamely agreed to stand in for Ambassador Mr. Lee Song. So welcome. We're pleased to see you. But look, 10 countries have received 75% of vaccines that have been administered to date. From your perspective, what does this say about how the rest of the world regards small island developing states? If these countries are not getting as big a slice of that vaccine pie, what does it say about the rest of the world?
Well, thank you, Julia, to having me. And actually, it is indeed a great pleasure to be here. And I think it clearly illustrated the unequal allocation of the vaccine situation globally. This pandemic, what this pandemic tells us is, the world is very closely interconnected with each other, and it's also very vulnerable. And like many people said, nobody is safe until everyone is safe. So I believe a small island country needs to increase their voice in the international forum, such as the UN, like World Health Organization, and as well as like Montana Forum. And we need to, let their voice to be heard, and let the world realize that there is truly, indeed, nobody should be left during this pandemic. Only everyone get vaccinated, and then the world can be, go back, can be built back better. Thank you.
And I'd like to follow that up with you, if I may, Ambassador Doyle, because there is so much in what we just heard that resonates with you, because I know that you're very passionate about making sure that the voices of SID states are actually heard. But I guess that from your perspective, the worry has to be that if there is no equitable vaccine distribution, that this could, if not collapse, certainly put the health systems of some of these SID states towards that point of breakdown if they don't have the institutional capacity to cope. Is that your biggest fear? Ambassador Doyle, can you hear me?
Sorry, yes, I have heard you, and thank you for that question. Look, your assertion is absolutely correct. The Minister Brantley did underline the failing, dwindling finances in many of these small island developing states already before the COVID pandemic emerged. Many of these states, some of these states already least developing countries, Cape Verde being one of them, but also they all face huge debt issues that they've been trying to get to grips with for the last maybe 10 years. And the COVID-19 situation has accentuated these issues to an unmanageable level of magnitude. But Juliet, one of the things that I'm hoping in the next 48 hours, something like 20 of the leading economies, finance ministers and central bankers will be meeting in Venice, as was foreseen already this year. And on the agenda will be three important issues, obviously galvanizing the 20 leading developing states across the world in terms of dealing with climate change, ensuring that the somewhat tepid economic recovery following the pandemic can be transformed into something of a more sustainable economic nature for all countries involved, but also vaccination. And one of the, I think one of the expectations is that one of the dear desires of many of the SID states is that we are, is to recognize before the G20 finance ministers that time is running out in terms of this vaccination program, but that we do need a universal vaccination rollout. Something along the lines of the IMF proposed some time ago, which would cost about $50 billion US dollars. But clearly, if and as long as the pandemic is uncontained anywhere, new and potentially vaccine-resistant viruses and their mutations are going to be a risk everywhere. This point was very elegantly made by Dr. Briand from the World Health Organization. We need to pay special attention, not just to dealing with this particular vaccination, but also future variations of this. And again, the other issue is that there's a very large divergence in terms of the vaccination rollout across the globe. More than half of the adults in most high-income countries are partially or fully vaccinated. Many poorer countries, and I include amongst this even some of the mid-income countries who are quite prominent amongst the SIDS, are actually still struggling in single-digit terms in terms of vaccination. For all the reasons, by the way, that Minister Brantley and other speakers have spoken about. So clearly we have an opportunity here in the next 48 hours in terms of this G20 finance and central bankers meeting, where we are hoping, the expectation is that they will kickstart, galvanize some measures to deal with rolling out this vaccination program, particularly vis-a-vis vulnerable low and mid-income small island developing states. But secondly, we need to also address the heavy burdens of debt vulnerability that John Zood from the World Bank mentioned earlier, which is only going to get worse if we don't deal with this issue now.
Absolutely, and a point as well that Mr. Brantley raised too about these debt responsibilities and the mechanisms to address them. I want to bring Councillor Fen Yong back into the conversation because, look, we know that the UN Secretary General, he has called for COVID-19 vaccination production to be stepped up so that we can have this more equitable vaccine distribution. So from China's perspective, what do you regard as the key mechanisms to make sure that those operations are scaled up to achieve that equitability? And how can small island developing states be involved in this process? Because the worry is that there seems to have been a mindset of excluding them in the past, and the fear is that they will be excluded in current and future developments.
Well, thank you. Actually, currently, there are some mechanism in vaccine production area. For example, we have Act A, vaccine manufacturing work group. Also, we have the COVAX vaccine manufacturing task force. And as far as I know, SEED is also a member of Act A. So from my perspective, SEED needs to increase its voice in Act A platform and to raise awareness about the unequal, the difficult access to the vaccine of the SEED country. And also, I believe the international organizations like WHO, like Gavi, need to expand the emergency use listing of the vaccine. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. We can hear you, so please don't worry, we can hear you.
Well, also, COVAX needs to increase its vaccine portfolio, and we need more. We need more vaccines, and of course, qualified vaccines, and to increase. Therefore, we can increase the accessibility and affordability of the vaccine. On the other hand, I believe international organizations and the member states need to increase their investment in the vaccine development further. For example, we need to have more vaccines which are easier for transportation and storage, and therefore they can more suitable for the developing countries, including SEED countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me bring Nicolas Koutros into the conversation, because what we've heard in the time that we have spent together is that SID states have very specific vulnerabilities. And how do you think these small island developing states can actually benefit from the financial sector digital innovations that will help them to overcome the vulnerabilities of size, debt, and location? Because I guess there is a school of thought that because they're hamstrung by these vulnerabilities, then they're losing out in terms of some of these innovations that are taking place, which could also be beneficial in the wider puzzle.
Thank you for the question, Juliet. Definitely, we know that small islands have budget restrictions, and these budget restrictions are right now under extreme pressure through the pandemic. The solutions, the technical innovations that we are proposing, and of course there are other solutions in the market, can help them with a very low cost to overcome this situation and to prevent as well from future pandemics. And in this case, their reputation as well will increase, and the attractivity for the touristic sector will be again restored, and of course the economy will become better. So through innovation, through low-cost application of this innovation, the economies of these islands can definitely improve.
And Nicholas, do you get the feeling that the clock is ticking on this one? Because small island developing states have been very dependent on various sectors, and there is a realization that they need to diversify to make themselves less economically vulnerable, and that if they don't have access to these innovations, it could potentially undermine that objective.
Well, I would not say that they don't have access to innovation. They do have access to innovation, and this access to innovation is not it's not costly. It is a matter of deploying measures that today are existing, that they are available, commercially available, and have the willingness to go with it in a systematic way. So again, this can be very efficient from a cost point of view and from a social point of view.
Okay, and time is running very, very tight, but I would like to put the final question to Ambassador Doyle. This is a very important subject, something which you are very, very passionate about. You've invested many years of your time in fighting the case for small island developing states. But are you worried about how they will cope if there is another pandemic? In other words, how underprepared are they? And more importantly, how would the fallout impact the rest of the world?
It's clear that they, as I said in my opening welcoming remarks, that these small islands, by virtue of their size, do not have the institutional capacity in terms of medical institutions, stocks of medicines. They have excellent trained doctors and nurses, but they don't have enough of them, which is why many of these small island states almost immediately last March or April, when the pandemic emerged, went into complete lockdown almost immediately and closed the borders. St. Kitts and Nevis was amongst the first small island state to do this. And this had an immediate, obviously, effect in terms of safeguarding the citizens. It had a devastating effect, however, in terms of tourism. The figures cited by the gentleman from the World Bank, between 60 and 80% decline in income streams associated with tourism, is a catastrophic figure and not easily replicated by other sectors of industry. So these issues do have to be, I think, addressed now. And as far as the future or preventing or mitigating future instances of pandemics, well, there are 2 points I wanted to make. First, and to pick up again on what Minister Brantley said about pharmaceutical companies wishing to be indemnified before providing any access to their vaccinations. I think there's an important role to be played by international organizations, the UN, the EU, and so on, in terms of encouraging and pressing regional developed nations to exert pressure on vaccine producers to partnership with global manufacturing sites in each of the SIDS regions. In other words, there could be 4 regional manufacturing vaccine centers in each of the 4 regions, under license by the big pharmaceutical companies. That's certainly one potential area of reflection going forward. And the second area that we haven't spoken about today at all is the vulnerability of the food and medicine supply chains at SIDS levels, which need to be, in my view, very urgently reviewed with the assistance, I might add, of the WHO, the FAO, and perhaps the EU, who have the expertise in this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Ambassador Doyle. And I would also like to extend my thank you to Nicolas Koutros. So thank you for providing the financial input, really putting things into context for us. That's most welcome. And also to our representative, Councillor Fen Yong of the Permanent Mission of China to the United Nations Office at Geneva and other international organizations in Switzerland. He was standing in there for Ambassador Mr. Lee Song. So we thank you so much for your contributions and also your patience, because we did have a few technical issues, but I'm pleased to say that we managed to conquer those. But you know what? It doesn't dilute the value of the message that the international community must work together to help SIDS states. It is in nobody's interest to see them fall. They have a unique set of problems. We must address those problems to work successfully with them. But at the end of the day, the vaccine distribution program is an important part of that solution. And it's incredibly heartening to see how various players have been trying to push this and to make things happen, such as China, for example, and indeed the World Bank with its financing and the work that it is doing with COVAX, the body responsible for vaccine distribution. So once again, thank you all so much for your patience, also to our online audience and to the members of the panel, some of whom had to leave us early for various engagements, but for those of you who stayed with us, we appreciate your time. All I can say now is have a wonderful afternoon, what remains of it, and I hope to see you again very, very soon. And to all of you, please stay safe.
Overture Solutions, leader in secure document printing and a privileged partner in digital transformation, was proud to bring its official support to the Group of SIDS Leaders Conference.